Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to take a deep and serious look at how vulnerable Iran's regime really is at this moment, especially as protests across the country show no clear sign of slowing down. What we are witnessing is not just another wave of unrest, but a complex and evolving challenge that touches every pillar of power inside Iran. For decades, the Iranian regime has relied on a combination of ideology, force, and fear to maintain control. The system was designed to survive pressure, both from within and from outside, yet the scale, duration, and intensity of recent protests suggest that something fundamental may be shifting beneath the surface. These protests are not limited to one city, one class, or one political group. They have spread across urban centers, smaller towns, and even traditionally conservative regions. This geographic spread matters because it makes containment far more difficult. When dissent becomes national rather than local, the cost of repression rises sharply. Another important factor is who is protesting. Unlike earlier movements that were often driven by students or middle-class reformists, recent demonstrations include workers, women, ethnic minorities, and even families of security personnel. This broad participation weakens the regime's ability to dismiss protests as the work of a small or elite minority. Economic pressure plays a central role in fueling this unrest. Years of sanctions, mismanagement, corruption, and inflation have pushed many Iranians into survival mode. Rising food prices, unemployment, and currency collapse have turned daily life into a constant struggle. When people feel they have little left to lose, fear becomes less effective as a tool of control. The regime has traditionally used subsidies and state benefits to buy loyalty or at least silence, but as resources shrink, the government's ability to maintain this social contract has eroded. This creates a dangerous feedback loop where economic hardship drives protests, and protests further damage the economy. One of the most critical questions is the loyalty of the security forces. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basij militia are the backbone of the regime's internal security. As long as these forces remain cohesive and loyal, the regime can survive even large-scale unrest. However, reports of fatigue, defections, and internal dissent raise serious concerns. Security forces are also part of society. They face the same economic pressures and social frustrations as ordinary citizens. When orders require them to act violently against neighbors, relatives, or even their own communities, morale can begin to crack. History shows that regimes often fall not when protests grow, but when security forces hesitate. The regime has attempted to counter protests through mass arrests, internet shutdowns, and harsh sentencing. While these tactics can suppress demonstrations temporarily, they also deepen public anger. Cutting off the internet may limit coordination, but it also signals fear and weakness to the population. Information control is another battlefield. Despite censorship, videos and testimonies continue to leak out through VPN and satellite channels. This constant flow of images undermines official narratives and keeps international attention focused on Iran. The regime's inability to fully control the information space exposes a vulnerability it did not face to the same extent in earlier decades. Leadership legitimacy is also under strain. Many protesters no longer call for reforms within the system, but openly question the entire structure of governance. Slogans have shifted from demands for economic relief to outright rejection of the ruling ideology. This represents a psychological turning point that is difficult to reverse. The issue of succession adds another layer of instability. With the supreme leader aging and no universally accepted successor, elite factions may be positioning themselves for a post-Khamenei future. Power struggles at the top can weaken decision-making and reduce the regime's ability to respond coherently to crises. Elite unity is crucial for authoritarian survival. If cracks widen between clerical leaders, military commanders, and political figures, the regime's response to protests could become inconsistent. Mixed signals and internal rivalries often embolden protesters rather than discourage them. Ethnic and regional tensions further complicate the situation. Protests in Kurdish, Balochi, and Arab-majority regions highlight long-standing grievances that go beyond current events. Heavy-handed responses in these areas risk inflaming separatist sentiments, which the regime views as an existential threat. International pressure also plays a role, even if indirectly. Sanctions limit financial flexibility, while global media coverage increases the reputational cost of repression. Although foreign governments are unlikely to intervene directly, diplomatic isolation can affect elite calculations inside Iran. At the same time, the regime still retains significant strengths. It has decades of experience in crushing dissent, a vast security apparatus, and a network of loyalists who benefit from the current system. The state's control over major industries and armed groups provides tools to weather prolonged unrest. Fear has not disappeared entirely. Many Iranians remember the brutal crackdowns of the past and understand the risks involved in continued protest. This fear can slow momentum, especially if protests fail to achieve visible gains over time. Another factor is protest organization. While spontaneous and decentralized movements are harder to dismantle, they also struggle to translate anger into concrete political change. Without clear leadership or a unified vision for the future, sustaining pressure becomes more difficult. However, the absence of formal leadership also denies the regime a single target. There is no figure to arrest or discredit to end the movement. This creates a stalemate where protests ebb and flow but do not fully disappear. The role of women in these protests is particularly significant. Their visibility challenges not only political authority, but also the social norms that underpin the regime's ideology. This cultural challenge is deeply threatening because it cannot be easily reversed through force alone. Youth participation is another long-term concern for the regime. While a generation that has grown up with limited economic prospects and constant restrictions is less invested in preserving the status quo, demographics matter, and Iran's young population represents both energy and unpredictability. The regime's messaging strategy has struggled to keep up. Blaming foreign enemies may resonate with loyal supporters, but it rings hollow for citizens experiencing daily hardship. Overuse of this narrative risks losing credibility even among those who once believed it. Looking ahead, the key question is not whether protests will continue, but how the regime adapts. If it relies solely on repression, it may survive in the short term but at the cost of long-term stability. If it offers concessions, it risks appearing weak and inviting further demands. Some analysts argue that the regime is not on the brink of collapse, but rather entering a period of chronic instability. This state of constant tension drains resources, exhausts security forces, and keeps society on edge. Over time, such instability can be just as dangerous as sudden upheaval. History offers mixed lessons. Some authoritarian systems have survived repeated protest waves by adjusting tactics and outlasting dissent. Others have collapsed unexpectedly when multiple pressures converged at once. Iran's future may depend on whether economic decline, elite divisions, and social anger align at a critical moment. The international community often asks whether there is a tipping point. In reality, tipping points are usually visible only in hindsight. What can be said is that each protest wave lowers the psychological barrier for the next one, making future mobilization easier. Trust between the state and society has been severely damaged. Even if protests subside temporarily, resentment remains. This erosion of trust undermines governance and makes crisis management more difficult across all sectors. In conclusion, Iran's regime is more vulnerable than it has been in years, but vulnerability does not equal imminent collapse. The system still has tools to survive, yet those tools are becoming more costly and less effective. Protests that show no sign of slowing indicate a deep and unresolved conflict between the state and its people. What we are witnessing is a long struggle rather than a single decisive moment. The outcome will depend on endurance, adaptability, and the choices made by both protesters and those in power. One thing is clear: the status quo is under intense pressure, and Iran has entered a period where change in one form or another feels increasingly unavoidable.